So, Simon, as somebody who is in touch with the scientific community, what is your sense of what is happening globally in terms of how scientists and researchers from all fields are collaborating to meet this challenge? What is your sense of what is happening out
Well, I think clearly this is the only game in town at the moment, and there's an enormous amount of work being done at every level. I speak to colleagues who are marking PhD proposals that are completely unrelated to coronavirus, and the feedback is constantly put in a paragraph about how corona is going to be affecting your research. So there's that sort of way that has just permeated everything. But obviously, the primary focus is to get a vaccine, to get improved testing and improved antibody testing, and I think we're seeing national governments pouring a lot of money into test centers. Obviously, private pharmacology is pouring a lot of money in as well. There's a bit of an arms race going on there, and so I think anyone who is working even tangentially in that space is finding it very, very easy to get funding, and also finding it very easy to get collaboration.
And it seems to be drawing in areas of the scientific community that you would not necessarily associate with medical science. People with backgrounds in all sorts of areas who feel that they can make a contribution seem to be drawn into this process.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience watching this, because we've, of course, as scientists, always been going on about how government needs to have more science in their decision making. And so we have seen governments putting together decision-making bodies that include doctors and sociologists and community health professionals and all of those sort of people. Unfortunately, we as scientists maybe realized too late that we had to remind decision makers that science is a very, very messy business, especially when you're dealing with something new and evolving like this. And so, you have to make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of arguing back and forth in science, and often, what we see presented as final science or facts at the end of the process is often, the result of 10 or 15 years of debate within the science community. And so I'm not particularly surprised that there's that much uncertainty among scientists at the moment, because that is how science works. You put together hypotheses, and you shoot them down, and you really wrestle stuff until you get a better understanding of what's going on. And so we really are trying to build this aeroplane while it's in flight.
Speaking of which, something that might be making that process a little bit easier and certainly a little bit faster is the use of artificial intelligence. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of how that is happening, give us a layman's definition, if you can, of artificial intelligence. What exactly are we talking about?
Okay, so artificial intelligence is really just a sort of catch-all term for how clever can we make a computer. And we know that computers are very, very good at just crunching numbers. You can give them millions of data points, and they can find patterns. That's not really artificial intelligence. AI, we're looking for an ability for a computer to teach itself, to teach other computers, and also, the holy grail is to see a computer that is able to think in a more human way, which is to be able to draw comparisons from a wide range of experience, and to be quite messy sometimes in its logic. But generally, it's become a catch-all phrase for the very, very big data type computing that is now used in a lot of research.
I think people not perhaps familiar with the process would be quite surprised by the notion of a computer that is able to teach itself. That is, I think, encapsulated, if I'm not mistaken, by the term machine learning. And it really is as simple as that, is it not? It's a machine that is able to almost take the process out of the human's hands and start evolving on its own, if you like.
Absolutely. So, it's very, very easy to teach, well, relatively easy to teach a computer all the chess moves in the world, for example, and then just get it to choose the best one each time. That's just a matter of having the time to program it in, and you could build that with wooden cogs if you had the time and the space. But it's to get a computer who is capable, or which is capable of looking at a situation, trying some trial and error, and then having a feedback loop where it says, okay, this worked, that didn't work, now let's get a little bit better and try again. And it's that has been something that has developed quite rapidly in the last decade or so. And so we're now getting computers which are relative novices at certain board games, teaching themselves over time and then becoming world beaters quite quickly. And so that's generally the baseline of what machine learning is.
Which I guess is the type of thing that you need of a supercomputer in a situation like this, because you're dealing with something organic, something that is changing, and you want something that can do more than just crunch the numbers.
Absolutely. And so the sort of thing that you're looking for in a computer like that is to draw comparisons and make connections that a human brain wouldn't necessarily have done. And so even before coronavirus, we were seeing machine learning, AI being used to develop new drugs, for example, to do genetic analyses of various different illnesses and syndromes and so on. And the two advantages that a computer has over a human being there is, firstly, the ability to look at an enormous amount of data, far more than any human could ever compute. But also to be able to draw comparisons and make connections that a human with our innate prejudices and limitations wouldn't necessarily be able to do, wouldn't necessarily occur to us. And we are seeing some success in all sorts of different fields now with computers being able to do that sort of work.
Tell us a bit more about the concept of big data. Again, I suppose difficult for a layperson to wrap their head around, because you're not talking about, you know, an encyclopedia full of data. You're talking about something much more significant than that, obviously.
Yeah, so you're not looking, so if you remember we used to have Encyclopedia Britannica CD-ROMs back in the day. That was the sort of, the very cutting edge of computers maybe 25, 30 years ago. And we thought that was quite clever. But now big data is evolving as we go. So this is not data that is entered into the computer by a human being, but it is data that is collected often in real time. So all of us carrying supercomputers around in our back pockets, which know exactly where we are. We're talking about cell phones, obviously, you know exactly where we are, how fast we're going, what places we're visiting, all of those sort of things. And that data can be collected and anonymized. So it's not like the computer is able to track you individually, unless it's asked to. And we're seeing that surveillance being used in some countries for sure. But that sort of, you know, you can track an entire city worth of movement, and that data is collected automatically and then used to infer all sorts of other things. And so software that we use all the time, things like the mapping software that we use in place of our GPSs these days, that warn us of where traffic jams are, for example, that is all utilizing big data. And not only then is it identifying where traffic jams are, but it's then manipulating our behavior to try and alleviate those traffic jams. And so that's probably the area where we're most familiar with interacting with the big data in our day-to-day lives.
In terms of the current context, Simon, and what it is that we are asking this artificial intelligence to do, if you like, is its biggest benefit its ability to analyze big data at incredible speeds with extraordinary accuracy? Or are we asking it to do other things? In other words, are we asking it to do more than just crunch the numbers?
Well, we've seen, for example, Singapore and China, amongst others, using cell phone apps to monitor their cities on a population level, and then to have feedbacks in about what your COVID status is and who you're interacting with and all of those sort of things. So there is that sort of very, very practical day or second by second management of your population. That's something that is very new. We couldn't have done that even 2 years ago. And so that's a very practical use of big data. And then within the labs, I think it's being used to rapid test, at least on a theory and a model level, different ways of interacting. What happens if you close down a particular sector of industry, or what sort of genetic analysis should we be looking for within the virus? What are the likelihoods of it being able to evolve quickly? All of those sort of things. These are projects that would have taken a lifetime 20 years ago, and certainly 3 or 4 years worth of hard research even a few years ago, are now being able to be done in a couple of weeks and turning these things over very, very quickly trying to find ways of responding to this virus medically and societally.
Interesting to see too the number of organizations, academic institutions that have built these forecast models, if you not even forecast, dashboards, if you like, of the current status of the disease, and on the basis of that information, what is likely to happen in the future. We've seen something happen along those lines at Wits University. What in theory sounds like a simple thing to do, I guess, is a lot more complex than that, but also has very important applications in terms of tracking what the virus is doing in any particular context.
Yeah, so modeling is used to be a sort of quite specialist thing that people thought of as an unusual and sort of additional skill. These days, it's bog standard in just about any sphere. And with particularly machine learning, you can be testing and retesting and improving your models all the time as you go, which used to be an incredibly laborious process. And so, yes, any lab worth its salt is probably going to be modeling whatever area of the virus they are working on, and getting that feedback loop so that as the model improves, so your understanding of the real world improves as well.
How important in this entire process is the human element? We heard an explanation not that long ago, Simon, from somebody working in this field who said, if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So even though we're talking about technology that is able to, if you like, teach itself, how important is the human element in that loop?
It is important, and it's vital that you have institutional knowledge around around the way that viruses operate and the way that humans operate. When you tell people to wear a mask, is that going to become a political issue like it's become in the US, or are you going to have a very obedient society like in Japan, which are culturally attuned to wearing masks, and so you're going to get a very, very high obedience rate with that? Those are often things that you can only really know as a human researcher. And we've also seen it, obviously my knowledge with modeling is mostly in the climate space and in the day-to-day weather forecasting space. And it's amazing how often having a human eye just look over and give the model a sort of common sense tweak can really, really help what you get out of it. Now that's in day-to-day weather forecasting where the stakes are maybe not quite as high. You've got to be very, very careful with that in long-range forecasting and long-range modeling, because you don't want to get your own human prejudices to come out of your model. You don't want to be disregarding anything that doesn't fit your hypothesis. So it is a balance between getting that human knowledge, which we are still able to provide flashes of insight that computers aren't able to do, but also to not allow your prejudices to influence the computer's outcomes.
That's an excellent explanation, and it speaks to, I guess, what a perfect partnership this actually is when you consider what artificial intelligence is able to do, and yet how reliant it remains on the human element in this process. It is a significant and important partnership.
Yeah, it's interesting with all of the work that's been done on artificial intelligence, how there are still things that for us feel completely innate. That a computer is not able to do, and a lot of it is about doing things like reading emotions and reading a room and those sort of things. But then we look at things that we would think of as being very, very human, like driving a motor car around. Machines are abundantly better at that than we are, and so it's an interesting dance. We are, with all of our work on artificial intelligence, we are, I would say, almost no closer to creating a genuine self-conscious machine than we were right at the very, very beginning of the process. There's some extra little spark there that is in not just a human, but in just about all animals that is not apparent in a machine.
And maybe, Simon, that speaks to one of the bigger questions around how artificial intelligence is assisting in this process. Are we placing, do you think, too much faith in it because of how perhaps awestruck we are by the level of technology? Do we assume wrongly that it's going to find an answer?
There is often a tendency to have too much faith in models. We saw that, I think, with some of the early modeling, which was which was predicting millions dead in each country, and that didn't come to pass. And I think part of the problem here is that a model created like that in normal time would have been heavily peer reviewed, would have been panel beaten at different conferences, and if it had gone through all of that process, would have then been elevated up to really being worked on quite hard before it was ever used in decision making. Now we've got guys, whacking stuff together on a spreadsheet and pushing it out into the public domain without necessarily that sort of feedback and careful checking. And so, yeah, it is. I think the mistakes that have been made in modeling have been through too many and erroneous assumptions, particularly when we didn't fully understand what type of virus we were dealing with. And also just a side effect of pushing stuff out into the open market and into the public consciousness before it would otherwise really have been ready.
Again, Simon, as somebody with their ear to the ground as far as the scientific community is concerned and perhaps some of the latest developments, are you surprised by what is happening globally in terms of how all of this technology is being harnessed? It surprised people who perhaps weren't as familiar with the process before this crisis. But does it surprise you that this enormous amount of collaboration is happening and this extraordinary technology is being harnessed to meet this challenge?
Yes, in some ways it does, because it's been an uphill battle of a generation trying to get decision makers to listen to scientists about climate change, for example. And here we've seen decision makers turn to their government scientists in a very, very trusting way, very, very early on in the process. And we saw that. I mean, the first major press conference that was given in South Africa was chaired by medical doctors, not by the minister, which I thought was really, really interesting. But it was also interesting to realize that the government decision makers understood quite quickly that a doctor is going to be able to talk about medical stuff, and his push is going to be to have a medical response. And an economist is going to think about economic stuff, and his push is going to have an economic response. And so those two competing views are often at odds with each other. And that's where the ability as a decision maker to sort of rise above this, to take all of that and to try and steer the country forward in the best way possible, becomes a very, very difficult process. I've also not been that surprised by the variation in response. But countries which have a history of not listening to scientists, and US, I'm totally looking at you here, have often put their scientists slightly at a back seat with their response. And some of the other countries which don't have strong scientific infrastructure as well have either had to just borrow the science from elsewhere, or haven't really followed that and have tried to manipulate things for their own uses.
Yeah, I mean, following on from that, it's been interesting, hasn't it, Simon, how science has, in a lot of cases, dictated policy. It's almost as if the scientists have said, listen, leave it to us. We're going to take it from here, and we are going to see what we can do using the expertise that we have and the technology that is available to us. And then on the basis of that, you can make your decisions. It's been an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a real world gap, isn't there? So if we take South Africa as an example, the initial response was we close everything down, and we follow the science very, very carefully, and we isolate ourselves, and we spread this curve out as much as we possibly can. Now, the scientists would have said, we absolutely have to do that, but it's up to you, the government, to make sure that everyone gets fed, that enough beds are made available for when people do get sick and all of those sort of things. And so there is this real world gap between what an ideal science response is and what the actual capabilities of a government to then look after their citizenry while they undertake that response actually is as well.
Just in terms of how you're feeling personally about this crisis, Simon, and maybe as somebody who comes at it from a slightly different angle, given your background, how confident are you that when we do, or if we do arrive at some sort of solution, that we will look back one day and say, wow, thank heavens for science, and thank heavens for the scientists?
Well, I think, I mean, so firstly, there's two things going on here. I mean, as a human being, I'm appalled by the economic impact and by the health impact and the personal impact of this whole thing. As a biologist, this has been the most interesting thing that's ever happened in my life, and to watch it play out, is just fascinating to the nth degree. I've been very impressed on the whole with the level to which governments have tried to follow the science. And I really hope that in the accounting of this afterwards, that we make a differentiation between being honestly wrong about something and making a mistake that at the time we felt we were making to the best interest of everyone, and being duplicitous and trying to allow other agenda to muddy our thinking. And I've got absolutely no begrudge against any government that makes an honest mistake, because all of us were flying blind. And no one really had the answers. And we see the answers change from almost daily in terms of what we understand about this thing. And I think on the whole, most governments, and I think South Africa's government in particular, can look themselves in the mirror and say, we've tried to use the best science possible as much as we possibly can, and we've made decisions in good faith. And I think that's a really, really impressive thing.
Just two or three more questions from my side, Simon. I'm going to go off script a little here, but it's very interesting what you've just described, because obviously I think there's, you'd have to be, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to appreciate the extraordinary health and other impacts of this particular virus. But if you were looking for a silver lining, perhaps what we're talking about is that silver lining. It's the way in which technologies are being harnessed. It's the way in which scientists are working together across borders. It is in the way this challenge is being met, certainly by certain members of society, and perhaps the way in which it has focused the minds of people on just how knowledge and the evolution of human knowledge is likely to get us out of this hole.
Yeah, so in terms of cooperation, it's an interesting one, because science, as it's these days set up, is inherently competitive. It's publish or perish, and you want to get to a paper before your competitors at the lab down the road get there, and all of those sort of things. And yet, I look at my grandfather back in the 1950s. He was a medical doctor who was studying polio. And it was his team in Johannesburg and Bloemfontein who picked up for the first time how polio spread epidemiologically, and they then shared that data with Salk in the US, and they worked incredibly closely with that American team to ultimately get a vaccine developed for the polio virus, and that's been one of medicine's great success stories. So the cooperation across borders predates this big data world that we now live in. I have certainly seen. I think there's less competitiveness at the moment as we all try and pull together and fix this big problem. Although I imagine we're certainly seeing with the competing vaccines that there is an awareness, certainly within the big pharmacy companies, that the first guys to really get a good vaccine going or good testing going are going to make an absolute mint. And so there is that capitalist veneer overlaying it. But certainly, I think cooperation on big global problems is not a new thing.
Interesting, very interesting, which maybe feeds me into my second last question. One of the projects that we are focusing on for this story is called a Moonshot project, sort of alluding to, a very ambitious project that, the objectives of which might or might not be met given the scale of the thing. And it harks back to our attempts to land somebody on the moon. That's probably the best example of it. But it does speak to, I guess, just what is being attempted here. And perhaps people shouldn't underestimate the size of the task. We're dealing with a new virus that is possibly changing, if on a very small level all the time. It's a moving target. But it does remain an extraordinarily ambitious project. And, it might not lead us anywhere. But at the very least, it has shown that people are capable of pulling together to at least try.
It is indeed. And if there's one lesson we might, and I hope we don't have to learn this, but that we might be very, very grateful for, is what if in 20 years' time we look back on this virus and say, thank God we got to practice on something that was that had this as its nature. And we weren't dealing with something like Ebola that was spreading as quickly as Corona is, that was affecting all sectors of society and was killing people, at rates of 10 or 50% of the population. So if something like that comes down the road, we will look back on this experience and say, wow, there's so much we've learned here in terms of how to manage societies and how to manage our own personal lives in this type of environment. We've learned what does work and what doesn't work, and so on. And so I think that the lessons we're going to learn from this are going to be way, way in excess of just the very, very basic lab stuff and the basic public health stuff. I think as a species, we're going to develop a certain degree of generational knowledge here, which, as I said, I hope doesn't prove valuable in the future, but may well.
Do you think people are likely to be surprised, Simon, at just how far we have advanced scientifically? I mean, I must confess that I have been taken by surprise by some of the innovations that I've encountered as I've researched this particular process. And maybe people aren't as in tune as they should be with just how with the extraordinary progress that science has made. I mean, artificial intelligence is a prime example of that.
Well, I think we're often not aware of how much technology we're using. How many people when they email a document from one address of theirs to another, realize that document has gone via a satellite and via a server in Barbados, and so what's happening now is we're seeing, particularly, say, the cell phone technology that is being used to track people in the Far East. That's not really new technology. That's just a different application of the same technology that's used in our GPS, in our map technology that we use in cars every single day. And it's the same technology broadly that works out what sort of ads are gonna pop up on our social media feed. So I think it's giving us an opportunity to think a little bit more about the amount of stuff that's going on behind very simple little screens that we interact with every day. And some of that is terrifying, and some of that is really optimism inducing. So I think it's giving all of us a chance to maybe make slightly more informed decisions, but also to realize just quite how certain types of privacy, for example, are very, very much a thing of the past.
Maybe a final question, Simon. How surprised do you think the scientists are by how their innovations are able to adapt to the times as well? I mean, you can imagine, well, I would imagine that some scientists perhaps would have had no idea 12 months ago that they would be using artificial intelligence to analyze the microscopic parts of a virus to try to understand how they might interact with certain compounds. It seems to me that, as you're presented with these problems, suddenly a lot of the scientists are realizing, hang on a second, I have developed something that is used in this area, but I can apply it in a completely unique area.
Yeah, well, I imagine that there's a good number of 60-year-old virologists who are amazed at how much time they're spending on meetings with 21-year-old computer engineers from the faculty down the road, and because that's the other thing with this is no one can be an expert in everything, and so there has to be within universities massive collaboration between faculties that never thought before that they would be talking to each other are now publishing together in a way that is very, very commonplace. And I think we've spoken very briefly about maybe a South African virologist cooperating with an American virologist, but actually it's a medical doctor cooperating with an engineer and with a sociologist and with a political scientist and those sort of things that I think are sometimes quite new experiences.
Sorry, one other thing springs to mind, Simon. Is there a tinge of sadness, perhaps, that when we talk about the major innovations, and the major advances, particularly when it comes to the innovations around meeting this particular crisis, that we tend to focus on the the usual suspects, if you like. It's let's chat to somebody in Washington, or somebody at Oxford University, or somebody in Munich. I mean, is there a tinge of sadness that perhaps the innovation seems to be coming from the same places?
Yes and no. I think what happens is, these days, tertiary education is all about rankings. So every single institute knows exactly where it ranks across every single possible facet that you can measure. I mean, in my day job, part of what I do is to work with an institution, collating all of that data and working out where they sit. And so what tends to happen then is, as a researcher, you want to work with the top places. So as long as we're seeing African researchers being phoned up from their lab in Harvard, then I think it's okay. But if we're not even seeing African researchers show up in Harvard, well, then it is a problem.
So where does that leave us, Simon? More optimistic, less optimistic? We're now, 5 or 6 months down the line since this virus was first identified. Are you feeling more buoyed, less buoyed than you were 3-4 months ago?
I'm generally quite optimistic. I tend to be optimistic by nature, I think, and very pro-science by nature. But I think as with everything, we just need to be reminded that no technology is inherently evil. It always comes down to how you use it.